Let's work on some electrics, shall we? First up, we've got this 2008 American Standard Strat. You know, for a long time, a Stratocaster was a Stratocaster. Some things changed, like the neck profiles, the pickguard materials went through several updates. Then custom colors became available, but from 1954 until Leo Fender sold the company in 1965, if you looked at a picture of a Strat, it was always the same guitar. CBS bought the company. They enlarged the headstock shape, and eventually they went to a 3-bolt neck, and some stuff like redesigning the pickups. But again, a Strat was a Strat, and it looked like a Strat. They still even had 3-way pickup selectors into the mid-1970s. It wasn't until the 1980s, 30 years after the introduction of the instrument, that Fender thought about making different versions available for purchase in the same model year. They started off making some vintage spec reissues and stuff, and they had an upgraded model or two with some extra switching options. There was the Strat. You have to say it all smarmy like that. They also had the Elite. Those lasted for a couple of years. Then in 1985 they came out with the American Standard. These guitars had a flatter neck radius. They had an updated trem system that rocks on a couple of knife edge contact points rather than the screws like the original ones. For a long time they had a different style of saddle. This one appears to have a vintage kind of look to it, but for many years there was a blocky kind of rectangular saddle, very solid looking compared to these vintage ones. American Standard is, of course, also the name of a plumbing fixture company that makes toilets. I don't know if that got bandied about at the board meeting when they selected the name, but it was a well-received product. You could then get a vintage style instrument, something that looked like it came from 1962, or something a little bit more modern in design. And especially the flatter radius fingerboard. It's the 1980s and you want to be a hair metal shredder. This makes it a lot easier than the vintage 7 1/4 radius. Of course, shortly after that, they came out with a plethora of Strat designs. An embarrassment of riches. You had the Strat Plus, you had the Performer, the Ultra, the Player Plus. More of them, I'm sure. I can't keep them all straight in my head. They were all subtle variations of the same theme. This one has a custom shop body, 2-piece ash, delightful sunburst. This was worked on by another shop, and the player isn't quite convinced. He thinks it's maybe time for a new nut, and he says it's hard to play in comparison to his other ones, or feels that way despite the string action being reasonable when he measures it. It just feels odd in various places over the board, and I think it might require some further fret work. But let's take some initial measurements. There are people who measure Fender fret height at the 17th fret. I always do it at the 12th. I keep it consistent over every single kind of guitar. Looking here, we have somewhere 4.5 to 5/64ths on the bass side, which might be a bit tall, and 4/64ths on the treble, which would be factory standard. And just for interest's sake, I'll see what that looks like up here. And virtually identical. Neck relief seems excessive. Depressing the string down at the body fret, I have a capo on the 1st fret. Measuring around the 6th and 7th fret. It is in fact 16 thousandths of an inch. Time for a truss rod adjustment. Okay, American Standard should be 1/8 of an inch. I can see that someone's been in there before me. The lacquer around the hole has cracked. These make quite deep pockets to deal with the plug. Let's loosen off a little bit. Yeah, it's loose. I'll give that a bit of a turn. Let's see what that does. Okay, that's now 10 thousandths, which would be factory spec. I usually take it a little bit less than that, about 8 thousandths. That's a little turn and we're there. That's 8 thousandths. Sometimes you can get them lower than that. Depends on your action preferences and a whole bunch of other stuff. And that has reduced the action to just over 3 and about 2.5 64ths. Which is now too low for this player. The player brought this along and was eager for me to try it. This is a very nicely made hex wrench from the Wera company. 1.3 millimeters, which is 50 thousandths, which is the size that these American Strat bridges use. And it's not a common size. You're not going to find that in your average set of hex keys you buy at the hardware store. Of course, I'll reduce the tension on the strings because we have to be raising the saddles. You don't want to be doing that with a bunch of downward pressure on them, these tiny little screws. That's how you strip things out. You take the time to detune. Raise these in equal amounts. You don't want these saddles leaning in one direction or the other. It's not a Telecaster. So the action is now 4/64 on the bass side, about 3.5 on the treble. Very comfortable. Player wants me to look at the nut. First thing I notice is there are some pencil lines on the surface of the neck, right adjacent to it, under a couple of strings. I also notice that the B string and the D string are lying right on top of the fret when I fret at the third. So there's no clearance under those. You see that little bit of a lisp there? That is only going to get worse with time. Removing fender nuts, depending on how they were installed, is either very easy or very, very hard. If they're glued in on all three sides, that's a bad day. You're basically stuck there to saw down the center and pick the little pieces out. Some glue's okay, and as I always say, put it on the front surface of the nut or the fingerboard, the porous end grain, which isn't likely to chip out. And properly fit, these usually don't require gluing in. It can be nice. They will shift if you take the strings off and try hard, but they shouldn't fall out on their own. So I'm just going to lightly score around it. The other thing is, because the headstock is cut from the same piece as the neck, with this little ramp coming to within 3/16 of an inch of the back of the nut, this is very fragile material. That end grain we were talking about, there's only that short length that's sitting on top of the grain below it, so if you knock too hard, this tends to shatter. And it's not easy to fix because these are lacquered necks and they're pale, so try not to break them. Okay, that's good. And it's just slip in on that side, and it started to come up on its own. So I will try a stabbing procedure on this side. Ah, nice. Beautiful. There is a little bit of yellow glue on the bottom surface of the channel, which I will lightly file away. Clean that up. And this is pre-slotted, and I checked before pulling out that they do actually resemble each other in terms of spacing. And I'm going to see if there's any chance that this is just going to slide right in. There is not, which is probably better than it being too loose. So I have to lightly sand this to get it to fit. Now seems a good time to clean off those pencil lines there without the nut in the way. Much better. It's good to keep track of your progress with the caliper. These are usually, the slots are usually around 120 thousandths, just under 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters. And so I got about 10 thousandths to go. This board has a 9.5 inch radius. I've got the nut sanded so that it will fit. Good snug fit. It is There's a bit of a rock in the center though, so I have to sand the underside of the nut a little bit to conform to the shape. That might actually be too snug. Could probably use a few more strokes of the sanding. Some 220 grit self-adhesive sandpaper stuck on one of the upper frets because there's enough room to maneuver, and I will use the fretboard itself as a template. Okay, snug as a bug in a rug. Don't think it needs glue. It's not going to move. These pre-slotted nuts are not plug and play. You don't just drop them in. They're always going to require adjustment to the strings. The nut slots are much too high. In fact, the action at the first fret here is kind of what you'd want to see at the 12th fret usually. It's probably 5 times taller than it needs to be. So when you're dealing with a tall nut, pre-slotted or not, you got to be conscientious because it's possible to shift the position of the slots one way or the other, depending on how you angle the file and if you're adding extra pressure on one side or the other. This is why I usually try and make the nuts as low as possible, leaving as little extra material. Having a pre-slotted nut is convenient in some ways. It saves the customer a little bit of money, but it's not really an easier solution. Like if you were a player with no experience in making a nut, I'm not even sure that's the way to go. Okay, when I press the string down between the 2nd and 3rd frets, a little bit of clearance in there. If I measure with a feeler gauge, it's going to be 21 or 22 thousandths. After all that filing, you can see these strings are really buried under the surface of the nut, which is not a great condition. It can affect tuning stability, actually, because there's a lot more area contacting the string than needs to be. Ideally, we'd like to see about half the diameter of the string above the surface of the nut, just enough to hold it in place. The other thing is, these pieces are actually quite fragile now, especially these ones at the ends. If you give it a knock, that's going to break off. They're just sort of unsupported. Okay, this is a flat mill file. I'm going to dress down the top surface. You don't want a huge slant on these nuts like you find on certain other guitars. They should be fairly flat across the top. Again, these are very much narrower too than Gibsons or Ibanez's or other guitars. So I'm just going to dress it down progressively and keep track. Occasionally I'm going to stop and sight down the end of the neck here to see how much of that slot is still left in every particular area. I'm using a kind of modified draw filing technique where I'm going not just forward but also sideways. I'm kind of preserving the radius as well. I can feel it. So I'm trying to take down the material evenly all the way across. I could get a 9.5 or 10-inch radius sanding beam and sand it from above like that, but it seems like overkill, and the tuner posts are in the way, and you know, this isn't that difficult. I mentioned that we like to see half the string diameter below the nut, or exposed above it. The exception to that is the E string, and usually the B string as well. I leave those full depth, about the same diameter of the string, because I have a couple of customers who, they do the Stevie Ray thing. You know, they're just muscular monsters when it comes to bending strings, and it's possible to have that first string pop out, your high E, which is disconcerting in the middle of a performance. File the ends and blend them into the sort of relief or chamfer on the ends of the fretboard. Just going to break the sharp corners front and back with some 220 grit paper. This is not a lot, and I don't want to sort of inadvertently round over enough that I'm affecting the takeoff point. This is just breaking that sharp edge, making it softer for the fingers. I'll go some 600 grit, 1200, 24, 36, 40, 6000, 8000. And that should be smooth enough for anyone. A little 600 grit to polish the insides of the slots. Without this, there's a kind of gritty feeling the first 30 times that you tune up. A little graphite pencil lead as a lubricant. And apply a little tiny droplet of light machine oil into the contact points of the tremolo system. The player's mentioning the trem is just a little bit hard to push in comparison to some of his other guitars, and this is probably a spring issue. He likes it so that it's floating slightly for an up pull. You know, sometimes people will want the trem sitting right on the body, and you'll end up with, you know, a whole lot of extra tension on the bar that you don't really need. But in this case, if you want it floating, this is where it's got to be. I'll have a look at the springs inside. There are specialized sets of different tension trem springs which you can buy, but in my experience it's kind of hit and miss, because one company's hard setting is like another company's soft. So mixed results with those. Sometimes the Indonesian or Chinese-made guitars have really wimpy springs in them that need replacing, and it's a good idea to hold on to some of those in the event that you want to customize. Well, here we go. We've got 5 springs. This is how Fender originally designed these guitars. They wanted them to be used with 5 springs in their classic, 1954 configuration. However, most of us get away with just using 3. So I'm going to remove 2 and see what that does. You want a great big long Phillips screwdriver for this. So it clears the body. Okay, that's floating just about the right amount now. Feels like there's a high fret up here that is choking things out a little bit. That'd be you, Mr. Number 13. Yeah, the ends seem to be up a little bit. We'll give it a little persuasion to start. No, it's still high. So, I'm going to grab my little fun tool here. I got one of these Stumac fret kissers, I think they're called, which are basically the same shape and design as a fret rocker, but they put some of this diamond abrasive, and very carefully, I mean, the process to make these things must have been kind of extreme, figuring out the film thickness for the adhesive and this stuff so that it would all end up in line with the ones on the outside, but they do a pretty good job for tasks like this. Guides off the other 2 frets on either side and gets rid of the high spot. Of course, having flattened the high frets in 2 or 3 locations, we now have to recrown them. So this thing is all straightened out and ready to play. It's a very impressive guitar. A little on the heavy side, but I don't mind that. Up next we have this really pretty green, I don't know what you say, that's kind of green, it's kind of aqua. It's a Telecaster Thinline with an ash body. And it seems to be set up pretty well, but there's some funky little buzzes going on in the bass strings. Well, I am immediately and intensely fond of this guitar as soon as I picked it up. I really like it. Looking at the action, we have just a hair under 4/64 on the bass side and 3 on the treble. And that is lower than Fender's factory spec, but it's well within possibility for most of their products. And let's see what's going on, you know. Okay, so we got stuff that's going on sort of in the center of the board. On the bass side, frets 5, 6, 7, 8-ish, which can be a truss rod issue sometimes. Yeah, I'm saying that's about 5 thousandths, which is a hair tight. There are also some rockable frets. Fret 8 in particular. It's not much, but it's enough to do the thing. Fret 11 too. That's pretty bouncy. So I'm going to start by loosening the truss rod a hair. We see the date stamp there. Looks like November of 2018. This is a very well fit neck. It's very snug in the pocket. A caution for people who want to adjust their necks this way, keeping them in the body. Put a piece of plastic or something resilient over top of that neck pickup. Like 4 out of the last 5 vintage Telecasters I've encountered have divots right here in the center where someone has inadvertently pried against that cover with their screwdriver. And you know, it's a fairly thin piece of brass. It doesn't resist very well. So I'm just going to shift that much, and that should hopefully do the trick in terms of giving us a little bit more relief. I'm going to check the relief again, and we are right at 8 thousandths, which is what Fender considers normal. Another opportunity to use the StewMac thing. Not a sponsor. They've asked me to, but I don't. Yeah, just talk about the things I use. If I like them, I'll mention them, but I don't like the idea of making sponsored content. But it's really good for this kind of thing, where I'm just kissing off a little bit, and I can keep the strings on, maintaining pressure on the neck and subjecting it to the same conditions it's going to face when it's in use. So it's a well-designed idea. And we'll do fret 11 as well. This one I think will require a bit more. Recrowning these can be a bit icky because Fender, of course, on their maple necks sprays finish over the frets, so there's a little fillet of lacquer in the corner. This is 600, and I'm going sideways across the fret to blend in the little file marks and make this a nice rounded contour. On the higher grits, I'll go in line with the fret, and I can see the cross-grain scratches really easily start off with a 600 grit. This is 1200 grit. I'm erasing those scratches, but I can see them in the surface there.
And then of course it's time for the polishing. You guys getting sick of this yet?
Here's a factory fret with some play on it. And this is the freshly recrowned one. The thing is, if you do two of them, you got to do them all. Okay, it's back to looking keen and playing mean. I really like this guitar.